Hey everyone, it's Intel here, and welcome back to another video. This video is my long-awaited Bedwars guide. My last Bedwars guide was about 2 years ago, and honestly that video is pretty outdated. The goal of this video is to help newer players and players who are struggling to be able to build up their skills and help improve their game sense so that you can consistently win Bedwars games. And although a lot of this guide is catered at newer players, I'm sure that if you're more experienced, you'll find something that helps you here as well. This video is also primarily made for solo Bedwars players, but that doesn't also mean that there's helpful information if you play doubles, threes, or fours. I also do want to say that if this guide does help you, then I'd really appreciate it if you considered checking out my Lunar Client cosmetics at the link in the description below. Every purchase of my Lunar Client cosmetics does help me as an individual content creator, so I'd really appreciate it if you guys check them out. But anyways, with that being said, let's get right into the video. When the game starts, your very first priority is to defeat your first rush. Your first rush is the team that's closest to you. On some maps, this could be the team that's to the left or right of you, or it could be the team that's diagonal of you. Your first rush changes depending on what map you're playing on, and identifying your first rush is your #1 priority when starting a Bedwars game. There's usually 3 types of maps that determine who your first rush is. The first type are side rush maps, where your first rush is either to the left or right of you. Side rush maps include Lighthouse, Quill, and Meso, just as a few examples. The second type is what I like to call forward rush maps. These are maps where your first rush is in front of you and to the left or right of you. But instead of diagonally bridging to these first rushes, there's usually an island that's directly in front of you that usually holds the diamond generator. For your first rush on these maps, you want to bridge out to the island that's directly in front of you first, and then bridge out to the other team that's next to that island. Forward rush maps include Skyrise, Apollo, and Rooftop as a few examples. And finally, there's diagonal rush maps, and these aren't as common as the previous two. Diagonal rush maps is when your first rush is behind and to the left or right of your base. On these maps, instead of straight bridging, you're going to be diagonal bridging towards your first rush. Diagonal rush maps include Rooted and Ashfire as a few examples. Identifying your first rush is a fundamental skill that you have to have as a Bedwars player. If you rush the wrong team, you're leaving yourself vulnerable to another team that sees you as the first rush. Identifying who your first rush is might be a little tricky at first, but the more you play, the more you'll start to identify the different types of map layouts and whether a map is, for example, a forward rush map instead of a side rush map. Once you've identified who your first rush is, your main priority is to take them out as soon as possible. One common mistake that I see a lot of newer Bedwars players make is that they spend too much time on their bed defense at the start of the game. The more time and resources that you're spending on your bed defense, the more you're suffocating yourself from other resources around the map, as well as leaving yourself vulnerable to other teams. Usually, I only place 1 layer of wool on my bed before I start bridging towards my first rush. This is ideal because it helps me save time and resources when going for my first rush, which in turn gives me a pretty big advantage when fighting them. I know there's some players who don't build a bed defense at all when going for their first rush. I don't really recommend this because a single layer of wool around your bed can mean the difference between your bed being broken and you keeping your bed. So I'd recommend at the very least placing a single layer of wool around your bed before you go for your first rush. Like I said before, you want to bridge out to your first rush as soon as possible. You don't want to spend that much time in your generator collecting resources because that leaves yourself vulnerable to your first rush. Depending on what map you're playing on, the amount of blocks required for you to bridge out to your first rush changes. In Bedwars, 4 iron will get you 16 wool blocks. On the map Orchestra, you only need 8 iron to get to your first rush. On the other hand, in the map Apollo, you generally need 16 iron to get to your first rush. Depending on the distance between you and your first rush, that's going to change how much time you're going to need to spend in your generator before you start bridging. With that being said, I don't recommend getting the bare minimum amount of blocks to get to your first rush. For example, on the map Lighthouse, you only need 8 iron to get 32 blocks, and that will be enough to get you to your first rush. But if the other team sees you, they can easily outplay you by bridging above you, and you won't have the blocks that you need to build up to them. Different maps have their own different iron requirements for you to get to your first rush, but I think as a general rule of thumb, getting 16 iron for 64 wool blocks is usually enough for you to start bridging comfortably towards your first rush on most maps. There are exceptions to this, however, like for example on the map Orchestra, saving up for 16 iron to start bridging towards your first rush isn't really a good idea on that map considering how close you are to your first rush. Since the map rotation is always changing and they're always adding new maps to Bedwars, it'll take a little bit of time to memorize how much iron you need before you start bridging, but that's just something that comes with experience. If you're new though, getting 16 iron for 64 wool blocks is generally a safe place to start with. When bridging out to your first rush, it is never a good idea to flat bridge. Flat bridging is when you only bridge horizontally and you don't build up at all while you're bridging. This is a really bad idea because high ground is a huge advantage in bridge fights. If another player has high ground over you while you're on a bridge, they can easily bypass you or knock you into the void. This is why one of your main priorities when bridging towards your first rush is to get high ground over them. If you notice that another player has high ground over you while you're bridging to them, then make sure to back up and space yourself out before you start bridging up, or else they can knock you into the the void. Be careful about bridging up too high for your first rush though, or else you're gonna take a lot of fall damage when you get to their base, unless you have something like ladders to negate fall damage with. While bridging, you should always stop around halfway before you get to their base to see what your first rush is doing. While bridging, your first rush isn't going to be within your field of view at all, and they could be taking the time to build above you while you don't even know it. That's why it's always important to pause and see what your first rush is doing as you're bridging out to them. It's also important to check and see if other teams are rushing you as you're bridging out to your first rush. New players do often make the mistake of, for example, side rushing on a forward rush map, so you should try to be aware of any other teams that might rush you while you're going for your first rush. When going for your first rush, you should try to avoid trades as much as possible. Trades are when you and your first rush bypass each other and take each other's bed. Although sacrificing your own bed for an opening to take out your first rush's bed might seem like a good idea, you'll still overall be at a disadvantage as the game progresses since you are a final. So try to avoid trades unless you're confident that a trade is the only way that you can survive your first rush. Before we continue, let me talk about the item shop and what items can be useful for you when taking out your first rush. Obviously, you're gonna need wool blocks to be able to bridge out to your first rush. In most situations, this is really all you need to be able to take out your first rush. However, if you're playing on a map that has a fast iron generator, then buying a stone sword and or ladders isn't always a bad idea as well. If your first rush has end stone or wood in their bed defense, you'll also need tools, but sometimes buying TNT is the better choice if you don't have enough iron for tools so that you can manage your resources more efficiently. This should be everything that you need before bridging out to your first rush, and in a lot of situations, wool will be the only item that you actually buy before you take out your first rush. Now, this isn't a very ideal situation where you don't die a single time before you take out your first rush. However, a lot of the times you are going to die at least a few times before you can take them out, and in that case, you're gonna wanna buy more than just wool. After dying at least once, some other items that you wanna consider getting besides wool are definitely a stone sword and shears if you can afford them, ladders to make your life more convenient, as well as to negate fall damage if you need to, a golden apple if you feel like you need it, and some other items that could be useful for taking out your first rush are a KB stick or an iron sword, but be cautious that these are very high investment items at the start of the game, and if you die with them, then your first rush is going to have more gold to work with than you have, and that could put you at a pretty big disadvantage against them. The last thing that you want to do is suffocate yourself from resources because you keep dying after buying expensive items, so try to avoid that outcome as much as you can while still buying the items that you know that you need to be able to take out your first rush. Say you lose your bed to your first rush and you become a final. If your first rush is still dead set on killing you and you're playing on a map that has a fast iron generator, a good strategy is buying chain armor, an iron sword, and a golden apple if you have the resources to do so. This will help you increase your survivability by a lot since you don't have a bed anymore. From here, if you're able to, go to your diamond generator and collect all of the diamonds, then go back to your base and buy either sharpness or protection and heal pool. If you're successfully able to do this, this will help you increase your survivability by a ton so that you can stay in the game. Do keep in mind that chain armor isn't really good in any other situation besides this one though. That's all I'm gonna mention about the item shop for now and what you should buy against your first rush, but we'll go back to it soon and cover more of the items that you should buy as your game progresses. So let's say you've successfully taken out your first rush and you still have your bed. I'll explain later in the video what you should do if you're a final and you don't have a bed, but let's continue with the assumption that you still have a bed in this situation. From this point in the game, the choices that you make are very dependent off of the state of your game. For example, if you notice that another team is rushing you after you take out your first rush, your priority should shift to taking out that team and defending your bed. If that's not the case, then usually a very safe decision to make is to go for diamonds after you take out your first rush. Bridge out to the diamond generator, collect the diamonds, and buy protection and the mining fatigue trap. Buying protection should be pretty self-explanatory, but buying the mining fatigue trap is really nice to have because it alerts you when players are at your bed, and it gives you some extra time to kill them before they can actually break your bed. If you want to play aggressive, you can also immediately go for another team after you take out your first rush, but try to make sure that no other team is going for you before you do this. Generally though, the safest thing to do after you take out your first rush is to go for diamonds and buy protection and mining fatigue. At this point in the game, you should have a lot more resources to work with, so let's go back to the item shop and discuss what items you should buy after taking out your first rush. At this point in the game, one of my biggest priorities is to buy iron armor as soon as possible. You should also have enough resources to get all of the tools. If you're not playing on a map that has a fast iron generator, then you should try at the very least to get an axe and a pickaxe. I also try to make sure that I have a few golden apples, and you should also have at the very least a stone sword from now on, or an iron sword if you can afford it. Fireballs are also a really nice item to have if you can afford them. They're honestly an S tier item. You can use them to knock players into the void from a far distance, or you can use them to easily boost up to places if you need to. Magic milk is an item that you won't need most of the time, but it can be very, very good in certain situations. situations. Drinking magic milk will make you invulnerable to status effects such as mining fatigue or blindness for a short period of time. If you're going after another team and they're staying near their bed, and you're confident that they have traps like mining fatigue and or blindness, having magic milk can save you from dying before you're able to break their bed. KB sticks can also still be very good because they have the potential to one-shot someone into the void, but if you're not able to do this, then they practically become useless. Also, if other players know that you have a KB stick, then they'll try to position themselves so that they don't get hit into the void as easily, so try your best to conceal the fact that you have one if you have one. One thing that I want to emphasize is that as the game progresses, you should actively be upgrading your enchants. After getting protection, your next goal should be getting sharpness and then upgrading your protection levels as you go. I can't emphasize enough how important it is to upgrade your enchants as the game progresses. Too many times I'll be at the end of my game and the last player in the game doesn't have any enchants at all, and having no enchants at the end of the game just makes you super easy to kill, so upgrade your enchantments as the game progresses. The rest of how your Bedwars game should go can be summarized as going after your biggest threat in the lobby and collecting emeralds from mid if you have a good opportunity to do so. Identifying who your biggest threat is in your lobby at any given time is a fundamental skill that you need to have for winning Bedwars games. At the start of your game, your biggest threat is undoubtedly your first rush, but as the game progresses, your biggest threat is going to change depending on the state of the game. Figuring out who your biggest threat is in your game is honestly very game sense based. It's not easy to determine who your biggest threat is at any point of the game, and it takes a lot of game sense, but I'll try to explain it the best I can. If you still have a bed, then you want to try and keep your bed for as long as you can. Some of your biggest threats in the lobby are going to be teams that are actively going for your bed. Say, for example, two teams are busy fighting each other. Those two teams aren't going to be as big of a threat as another team that is not fighting anyone but is going in the direction of your base. Let me give you another example. Say there's two teams that are relatively near you and both of them have taken out their first rush. One team is bridging out to an island that is further away from your base, while the other team is bridging out to an island that is closer to your base. Your biggest threat is going to be the team that's bridging to an island that's closer to your base. When identifying your biggest threat, you should also be looking later into the game. Say there's a team that's going to mid to collect emeralds. While they may not be a big threat to you now, if later in the game both of you are some of the last teams left, they could have a significant advantage over you because of the items that they bought in with emeralds. Identifying who your biggest threat is very situational and is honestly quite tricky, but you should try to be strategical with what teams you decide to go for after you take out your first rush, and try your best to identify what team is going to be your biggest threat and go for them. The best way to refine this ability is through game sense, and the more that you play, the more you'll be able to identify who is an obvious threat to you at any given point during a Bedwars game. It's also very helpful to take advantage of your scoreboard and the kill feed in chat to get a general idea of what the state of your game is in. Now, let's talk about mid. Going to middle and collecting emeralds can place you at a huge advantage in your Bedwars game, and is something that you should do if you have the opportunity to. There's a ton of amazing items that you can get by going to mid and collecting emeralds, and I wanted to take some time to cover each item that you can get. Ender pearls are really good because they essentially allow you to have another life if you're a final. If you're about to lose a fight or you're falling into the void, then you can pearl away and escape into safety. Ender pearls are best used defensively to escape near-death situations if you're a final, but they're not as important if you still have a bed. Potions are extremely good for playing aggressively and killing other players. There's three types of potions you can buy: invis potions, speed potions, and jump boost potions. Invis potions are arguably one of the most broken items in the game. Drinking them will make you go full invisible for 30 seconds, but will wear out as soon as you get hit. While invisible, other players will still be able to see your particle trail and your footsteps, so make sure to be looking out for these two things if you suspect that an invis player is around you. The reason why invis is so good is because it lets you sneak up on players and get free hits on them while they're not expecting you. Invis potions are especially good for killing other finals in your lobby. It should also be noted that invis potions become much better if you also have a jump boost potion active as well. This is because jump boost potions make your movement much harder to track while you're invisible, and it also makes your particle trail and your footsteps while you're invisible much less noticeable. Even if your opponent knows that you're invisible, it's still going to be really hard for them to hit you and knock you out of your invis. This can allow you to easily get the first 2 or 3 hits in a fight, and if you're using a sharp iron sword, that's basically like half the other player's health gone. Jump boost potions and speed potions are good on their own, but pair amazingly with each other. Jump boost can help you escape fights by building up and getting to high ground, and speed potions can make it really easy to start combos. In combination with each other, jump boost and speed potions allow you to play really aggressively. This is my favorite potion combination in the game because of how aggressively it lets you play for a relatively cheap price. Bridge eggs are a super underrated item with a lot of good utility attached to them. When you throw one, it creates a wool bridge following the projectile trail of the egg. These can be very useful if you're trying to bridge to another player, but you can't safely do so because you know that they have fireballs or a bow and arrow to hit you off with. Bridge eggs can make it much more safer to get to these types of players, as well as to get high ground on other players. Diamond armor is pretty self-explanatory, it just makes you more tanky. This can be good to increase your survivability, but doesn't really have the same amount of utility as some of the other items that I've mentioned. However, it does stay with you even after death, so if you're really struggling to win fights, then it's a solid option to buy, but it isn't always necessary. Diamond swords can be really good, especially in combination with sharpness. Having a diamond sword with sharpness allows you to easily shred through other players, and I've personally had a few situations where buying a diamond sword last second has allowed me to survive a fight. Obsidian is also very self-explanatory. It costs 8 emeralds to get all the obsidian you need to cover your bed with. This makes it much more difficult for players to break your bed since you need a diamond pickaxe to do so. While obsidian does make it really difficult for inexperienced players to break your bed, for experienced players this isn't as big of a problem, and obsidian becomes almost entirely useless after your bed is gone. If you do get obsidian, then make sure to hide it under a layer of some other block so that people don't know that you have obsidian. Knockback bows don't really have as much utility as the other items that you can buy with emeralds, unless you really want to annoy other players. And finally, there's one more thing that you can buy with emeralds, but it isn't actually an item, and that is the player tracker. The player tracker allows you to track the location of any other player, but only if all other beds are gone first. Player trackers are really useful for knowing if you're going to be rushed by someone who is invisible. If there's only you and one other player left and you know that they've gotten emeralds, then the first thing that you should buy with emeralds is a player tracker to track that other player. That way, if you know that they're invis and you can see that they're coming after you with the player tracker, you can run away and position yourself in a good place to fight them while they're invisible. Or you can keep running away from them until their invis wears off. Hopefully now you can understand all the items that you can get with emeralds and how to use them efficiently. Even if you don't need the emeralds, it is still good to go for mid if you have an opening to do so, and collect the emeralds so that no other player can get them. And if you do get emeralds but you still have a bed, it's usually a good idea to keep some of those emeralds in your ender chest, so if someone does take your bed, you can still buy a pearl or some other items to increase your survivability. Okay, so now I wanted to explain what you should do if you become a final. Your main priority should be to increase your survivability as much as possible and to avoid fights that you know you can't take. Oftentimes, the best thing to do if you become a final is to collect emeralds and diamonds and get yourself as stacked as you can, and to break beds and get final kills if you have a good opportunity to do so. You should try to play as defensive as you can and to get yourself in a position where you're very hard to kill. Once you get stacked enough, you can start playing more aggressively and go for other teams to take them out. One last thing that I wanted to talk about is voiding. Voiding is a strategy where you throw yourself into the void so that you can respawn at your base if you still have your bed. Essentially, it's like fast traveling back to your base. Voiding can help you if you're across the map but you need to get back to your base fast to defend it because you know that someone is going for your bed. It's also useful if there's no other teams left in the direction that you're rushing, so you can void and go for the other teams on the other side of the map. And it's also a good idea to void if you don't know what's going on near your base, so you can collect information on what other teams around you are doing. Be careful not to void too late though, because the last thing that you want to do is respawn at your base with no gear, just as another player that's way more stacked than you has just broken your bed, and you pretty much have nowhere to run at that point. Anyways guys, that's pretty much it for this video. Thank you so much for watching, especially if you made it to the end. It really does mean a lot to me. I'm sorry that this video took so long to put out, but I hope you guys understand, and I hope you guys enjoyed the editing in this video. Once again, if this guide helped you and you want to help support me, then you can consider buying my Lunar Client cosmetics at the link in the description. But anyways, thank you guys so much for watching the video. Once again, it seriously means a lot to me, and with that being said, I'll see you guys in the next video. Peace out.